Hi, welcome back to Howl Along with Spot. We wanted to get back to speaking a little bit more about the Great Compromise, also known as the Connecticut Compromise, which is the origins of the Electoral College and the way our Senate and Congress is set up. And we wanted to speak a little bit about that because it's a lot about what concerns us today. And actually, let's go back there. This is a button we've recently made up to promote the concept of a presidential crimes commission in the beginning of the next year to investigate some of the damage done to our rule of law by the current administration. Now, the 13 original colonies they're all like, we use the term state, and I often confuse it, as an anarchist and speaking to people about the government and states and all like that. And even back when I was Marxist Leninist back in the 80s and 70s, um, confuse people because state, when people who are like radical and revolutionary talk about state, they mean like a national government. They mean the government. And here it means just a small portion of the government. And the reason is because all of those colonies, I mean, they're the sizes of nations. And so they were looking at trying to get a confederation together that could allow them to protect the colonies against very much more powerful European powers. And to do that, they had to form a federal government. People were afraid of a federal government, just as people today are much more irrationally afraid of a world government, even though that's not a very likely thing. That's a whole different story. And so they came up with this compromise thing. And what that did is it had the Senate, which was based on the British House of Lords. Originally, it wasn't even elected. The governors of the states appointed the senators, and the congressmen were selected by the people, and the Senate was supposed to be forming this conservative backwater that would held office for 6 years at a time, and so prevent the mob from taking over and all like that. And the idea that to preserve the state rights, they'd have two senators for each state, no matter what the population. And what I have up here, if you see on the screen there, um, if you look at it, there's 100 senators. 16 of them are selected by 8 states with the smallest populations. And you can see there, it's looking at the 7 least most populated states. Those 7 there are the states that have I should be using this thing here, excuse me. The states that have only one congressman. In other words, their populations are so small they can only comprise one congressional district. And then, even if you add the next largest state, Rhode Island, which has 2, the total still comes out to less than just New York City. So less than 7 million people in a country of 330 million people, less than 7 million select 16 of the 100 senators in our Senate. And if you add the next 8 most populous states, that brings it up to 14.6 million people. 330 million people, 5% of that would be 16.5 million, somewhere around that. And this is only 14 million. So less than 5% of the country produces or selects 32. That's 1/3 of the Senate. And then if you look at it, this is an article we wrote about a year and a half ago about how to abolish the electoral college. By 2040, and of course we've had this plague hitting our country and causing a lot of deaths, but by these statistics at that time, by 2040, half of our population will live in just 8 states, and an additional 20% will live in the next 8 most populous states. So 70 senators will be selected by only 30% of the population. And right now, let me find the right screen here. Hold on 1 second. Okay, so here, now these are the most populous states. That's almost half of our population. They're selecting only 16 senators, the same amount as only the 8 least populous states. And again, that's less than 7 million people. A fraction less, over a couple of million less than in New York City alone. And these half of our population has only the same amount of states, senators being selected. And this is why, there's been a recent thing that, we just recently passed 200,000 deaths in this country from coronavirus. But, even more important is that based on that model and consistent with that current rate of death toll, we're going to reach 410,000 by the end of the year, and 407,000 were lost by the United States, servicemen in the United States fighting in World War II. And, if you take out the amount that was lost in the Pacific Theater fighting against the Japanese, that's about what we should have lost to coronavirus had we had a sane response by a competent president. So right now, Trump is on track to, by the end of this year, having killed more Americans in 1 year than Hitler killed in 4. From his incompetency, from his indifference, and from his perspective. And the first thing people say about this is, well, first thing they go to the Constitution about mob rule and all like that. Next thing they say was that this is the only way. We can't have California and New York telling the rest of the nation, people in Nebraska, how to live. But look at these states. New York is mentioned, but you know what? And they mean New York City. They don't mean New York State. But Florida and Texas has more people in New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Ohio, Georgia, North Carolina. Does that sound like radical states? Instead you have this, and look at some of the democracies. Excuse me there. I don't know what happened there. These, the least most populous states, District of Columbia, they stuck that in there. It's not even a state. But it would be significantly more people in District Columbia, which doesn't have representation, than in Wyoming, which does. That's not democracy. And something else about this, because when we look at this, when the Great Compromise was done and the Electoral College and all these things were formed, you had the least most populous state being Delaware and Rhode Island. But the thing is, that was the economy of the ox cart man. That was family farms, 200 to 500 acres, meeting their basic needs and a little bit more to invest in improving their lives as time goes on and passing on to the next generation, all that kind of stuff. They're talking about basically middle class Americans. You know, they're not talking about agro industry where farms are tens of thousands of acres and where you have a population, that is very much older, very much whiter, very much more wealthier. You know, one of the least most, but the second least populous state during the colonial days was Rhode Island. They captured and sunk a British ship that was trying to enforce the tax laws a decade before the fucking revolution began. They weren't like Nebraska. They were radicals because they were a demography. They weren't older folks who were living from an economy that's a global economy. You know, they weren't, the kind of people who are voting in people who don't represent the majority of the people. It's not at all what the revolution was about. And part of what goes into this is the demographics of Fox News. And this is an important fact. In 2008, and from then, you look at this, um, their demography just continued aging. Their prime viewer is 68 in 2015. 68 years old. 94% of the viewers identify as Republican or leaning Republican. And certainly they're not all in the least populous states, but that has this reflection that people who live in isolation of other people who live in, gated communities and commute only through the internet and everything else and get all their information from this one news network that's reinforced by this tremendous advantage the Great Compromise gives this one demography. And the trouble is a demography 68 years old. You know, give me a break. 200 years ago, most people 68 would be close to dead. Now we have people who live on for fucking ever. And their heads are still fucking in the 50s. Trump ran on an economic program of bringing back the America of the 1950s, that could not compete economically in this era. He totally rejected science, and that's why we are getting our ass kicked. It does not matter, like, what you think is happening with the stock market right now. In terms of technology, people talk about the opium crisis. Do you realize that there is a tremendous bumper crop of opium this year? And it's happening because the Taliban has gotten into solar energy and is applying it more than the United States is. And so people who live pastoral cultures are surpassing the United States, the most industrial country in the world, is being surpassed in technological application of solar power by a pastoral society because our president wants to fight science, doesn't believe in science. And I these videos only allow me about 15 minutes, so I only have about a minute left, but I want to wrap it up. We cannot move forward with this current situation. We need to change it. If it wasn't for the Great Compromise, Trump would have been impeached. Plain and simple. There'd be at least